Christ is risen.
Truly is risen.
So this gospel we just read is pretty familiar, isn't it? You know about this feeding, right? What do we call it when we refer to it? We call it the feeding of the 5,000. There were more than 5,000 though, weren't there? There were 5,000 men. So there were women, children. There were a lot of people there. Perhaps there were 20,000 there. So why do you think Jesus did this miracle?
To show them that he is God.
To show them he's God. Okay, that's true. But sometimes people believe in God, but they start not doing so well in life because they don't have enough faith. They believe in God, but they don't really feel in their heart that God will help them. I just had somebody write me today about something, and his son had a problem with his meniscus of his knee. And there were two options. One was to remove the meniscus, it would take 20 minutes. And the other one was to repair the meniscus, and it would take an hour and a half, and it would probably be a 2 or 3 month recovery time. And if he had that recovery time, he wouldn't be able to go to camp like he wanted to. It would impact his soccer career because he probably wouldn't have been able to start with soccer in the fall he's in high school, I believe. And they prayed, and they're Protestants. They laid hands on his leg, on his knee, and the son told his dad, "I feel kind of weird about that," but they did it. And then when they had the surgery, the surgeon came out after 20 minutes, and the father thought, "Oh, they removed the meniscus, which means you'll have problems." The meniscus is this like kind of floating part in your knee. You know, if your knee is loose and you kind of go like that and you jiggle it, the meniscus helps do that. It's not the kneecap, the bone part, but it's the cartilage underneath. And if you remove it, then eventually you're going to have problems with something called arthritis. Your knees are going to hurt when you're older. He thought, "Oh no," he removed the meniscus. And the surgeon came out and said, "Well, actually, your son had a genetic anomaly, a genetic problem that most people don't have, where his meniscus was actually not fully formed. The meniscus is supposed to be in a C, kind of, but it wasn't. It was solid, right? Maybe like a circle or like a D or something. So it wasn't right. And it had torn exactly in the spot that it should have been hollowed out. So the surgeon just hollowed it out, and he said his recovery time will just be a couple weeks. He'll be able to go to camp and everything." So I thought that was an interesting story. And, God heals anybody, whether they're Orthodox or not Orthodox. Even unbelievers he heals. If you look at the lives of the saints, and I hope you do, or have them read to you, tons of times Muslims are healed by the prayers of saints. And to this day, St. George heals many, many Muslims. Many Muslims. Because St. George is very popular in countries that have both Christians and Muslims in the East. God can provide, God can heal us. But a lot of times people don't think that he can, or don't think that he will. So I think for sure that Jesus Christ did this miracle not only to show he's God, that's true, yeah, of course. But not only that he's God, but he can provide for you. Even something simple as that you're hungry, or that you have a knee that hurts, or that you're very sad about something, or that you're having trouble in school, anything, whatever it is. Jesus can feed 20,000 people at least, easily. He didn't even need 5 loaves and 2 fish. He could have called down bread from heaven. But he can do anything he wants, and he can help us. So yes, it's good to believe Jesus is God, and that God exists and loves us, but I think we need something more than that. We need to know that God can help us in everything. I was just reading something that the Surgeon General, he's the chief physician of the country, has said that there's an epidemic. You know what an epidemic is?
Yes.
What is it?
Something that everyone gets sick.
Something where everyone gets sick, where lots of people get sick. That's true. Usually we think of an epidemic in terms of like a virus or something like that. Like COVID was called a pandemic, but we won't worry about that. The Surgeon General said there's an epidemic of loneliness in our country. There's a lot of people that are lonely. And loneliness causes disease. Did you know that? When people are very lonely, they have more heart problems, they have more strokes, they use bad things and put them in their body more, they have more obesity. All these things happen when people are very lonely. And a lot of those lonely people believe in God, but they feel lonely. Now, what I hope happens with you in your life very much is that you're never really lonely. Now, it may be lonely like, you miss somebody, okay? It may be lonely like sometimes you don't feel people understand you. If you ever go to work and almost everybody's not a Christian and doesn't talk like Christians, sometimes you feel lonely in that way. I don't mean those kinds of things. I mean that you feel like that somehow nobody cares if you live or die, or that it really doesn't matter what you do, nobody's going to notice. That kind of feeling. But we shouldn't have that feeling if we're Christians, because God can help us. God is very near to us. How close is God to you?
Inside you.
There you go. He's in your heart. That's pretty close, isn't it? Huh? That's closer than somebody standing next to you. So you're never alone. And what I would advise that you do to never be alone is really learn to pray, learn to read the scriptures, the lives of the saints, and see that God works for his people all the time. Whether it be some Protestant who prays and his son's knee is cured, or whether it be us praying in the church. We're praying for some people that are now sick with cancer. Whatever it is, God never abandons us. God is always with us. He's not just with us, he's in us. So we should learn to really be aware of that. And if you just go through your life and you don't really pray much and you don't read the Bible much, well, you'll have a lot of times when you feel very alone, when you feel like, what do people care? That's a terrible feeling to feel. That's one thing I think we should get out of this miracle. By the way, this miracle is in all four Gospels. Very few things are in all four Gospels. But this is in all four Gospels. So let's look at it a little bit. There's a whole bunch of people that Jesus is teaching, and it's in a desert place, and there's no food. And he's taught them all day long, and they're tired, and they need to eat. So Jesus goes to Philip, one of the apostles, and he says to him, where can we buy bread? Now, why do you think Jesus asked that question? It's answered right in the scriptures. Right? The next sentence answers it. But do you remember why? Why did he ask that question? He knew there was no bread to buy. He knew they couldn't have bought enough bread. They didn't have enough money, nor did the village next door probably have enough. So why did he say, where can we buy bread? Did you listen? You got to listen. Anybody? Why did he say, where can we buy bread? What does the scripture say? Was anybody listening? Nobody was listening? Oh boy, you guys. He said this to prove him. He said this to test him. He was testing his faith. And so what did they say? Wow, if we had all this money, we couldn't buy enough bread. We don't even have this money, but we couldn't buy enough bread. And then they said, well, there's this little boy who has 5 loaves, small barley loaves, real little, and not like big loaves of bread, even if they were big loaves of bread. But they only had 5 little loaves. 5 little loaves. So they had a little bit of food. And he tested Philip. He was testing him. And testing Peter. Because Peter said, hey, we have just 5 loaves. What is that among so many? But I think there's another reason why he asked Philip. It doesn't say so in the scriptures, but it's clear from reading the gospel that this is something that Jesus was constantly telling them. He told them when he called them, said, from now on you will be what? They were fishermen. What did he call them? Fishers of men. So he was constantly telling them that they were responsible for spreading the gospel, what he was teaching them, to the rest of the world. So he's going to Philip saying, where can we buy bread? What he's really telling Philip is, Philip, I want you to take care of people. Now sometimes he takes care of people, we take care of people by asking God to help, because we don't have the ability. In this case, they didn't have enough bread. They didn't have enough money. The apostles did help those people, didn't they? So he prayed and gave thanks, which is what we should always do before we eat. And then they started passing out the loaves and passing out the fish. And as much as they passed out loaves and fish, they still had some in their hand to pass out. Can you imagine that? Could you imagine how strange that would be to hand somebody a fish and still have a fish in your hand? Huh? Wouldn't that be amazing? And they fed 5,000 men plus women and children. And they collected up how many baskets? 12. Why 12? There's 12 apostles, right? So he asked at the beginning, Philip, go get some bread. Philip says, we don't have enough money for bread. And then Peter says, well, we have this little tiny bit of bread and 2 fish. But that's not enough. That wouldn't even be enough for the apostles. It's a tiny bit of food. And Jesus says, give it to me. He feeds everybody. And the apostles then take up more food than they started with, by a lot. Because these baskets actually are provision baskets. They're like big enough for some of you children just to jump into and hide. They are that big. They're big baskets. And the apostles helped according to how they could help, right? I mean, they couldn't multiply the loaves, but God, imagine what would it be? Sometimes people talk about, if I had a time machine, where would you go? Would you go back to ancient Rome, or would you go back to Egypt, the time of the pharaohs? Would you go back to the dinosaurs? I'm sure some of you would say dinosaurs. Come on, admit it. You'd say dinosaurs. Admit it. You would. Yeah, your face says you'd say dinosaurs. But what about if you went back to the time of Jesus and saw things like this? Saw that he was a man who spoke unlike any other man. Because he wasn't just a man, was he? What else was Jesus besides a man? He's God, right? So he spoke as God and man. And to see the multiplication of the loaves, could you imagine what it would be like to be the servants who were putting water into those big bowls, those big jars, and then say, okay, now take it to the master of the feast. The servants knew they put water in. They take it to the master of the feast, and he says, this is the best wine I've ever tasted. Could you imagine seeing those things happen? Be pretty cool, wouldn't it? I think that's when I'd want to set my time machine back to, is that period of time. To see and witness those kinds of things. This parable teaches us not only that God is and God exists, of course he does, and we know God loves us, but how much do you know it? How much do you really know it? Do you depend on God for everything in your life? Do you believe him for everything in your life? Well, this miracle shows us that we should believe that he will help us with everything in our life. Now, at the very end, they said something. They see this great miracle, and all these people are around, and the people start to murmur among themselves, like, this is amazing. What did we just see? So they say, this is of a truth the prophet that should come into the world. Were they right? Is that a correct statement? That since Jesus did that miracle, he must be the prophet that came into the world? Is that true? True or false? On a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being super true, 1 being false, what do you think it is? Is it 10? Is it 1? 10? What do you think? That he's the prophet that should come into the world. Is that a super true statement or a false statement? Somebody tell me. I don't think it's 10. 5. Okay, 5's a good number. 5's a good number. You know why I don't think it's 10? Because he's not just the prophet that would come into the world. He's also the king. He's also God. He's also the high priest. So just to say he's the prophet is not describing him fully enough. That's like describing me and saying, oh, well, Seraphim's the person who tells Chuck Norris jokes. Is that true? Yes. Is that everything about me?
No.
No, it isn't, is it? I mean, it's not the most important things about me. Is that these people, they recognized that he was special, but they didn't recognize that he was God yet. And that's what a lot of people do, even that are Orthodox Christians. They say they believe Jesus is God, but they don't live like they believe he's God. They don't trust him with everything in their life. So you have to learn to trust him with everything in your life, so that you don't say he's a prophet, or even saying he's God. That you say he's everything. He's my life. He's the truth. He's the only way. That's what you need to learn about Jesus. And the only way you learn that is by, struggling to be a Christian, struggling to love your brother and your sister, not be mean to them, or if you're a little brother, not to bug your big brothers too much, right? You struggle to do all those things. And you read the scriptures. You should be reading scriptures or having them read to you. If you're not doing it, then you're doing it wrong. You've got to be doing that. The lives of the saints. And then God will help you with everything. And you'll believe that there's nothing too big for him. And he'll help you in everything. That's the Christian life. Not to believe that Jesus is just God. That's not enough. He's not just God, but he's God who lives in you. He didn't just rise from the dead. You're rising from the dead right now. The resurrection's happening in you right now. You're becoming more alive. And then when your body dies, it'll be perfect in the blink of an eye at the end. So I hope that I hope you like this miracle. This miracle is very beautiful. And it really teaches us not just that Jesus is God, but that Jesus can help us with everything. Christ is risen.
Truly is risen.
Christos voskreσε.
Christus voskreσε.
Christos anriat.
Adorado e
God bless.